Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
On the Piccadilly line between King's Cross and Russell Square, it's what they call a double whammy. So the explosion has happened, it's gone out and hit the tunnel walls, and it's what they call a repeat explosion. So it's gone bang, bang. And that's why there was such a huge death toll.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
I've had a report that there was an explosion at Liverpool Street and Edgware Road.
We've had a report of a bang west of Edgware Road. I don't know anything about Liverpool Street.
I'm the supervisor of Moorgate. We've just had a big explosion. There appears to be something ahead of the train in the track. We've evacuated.
20 years ago, July the 7th, 2005, a day that shattered London. 52 innocent people were murdered and hundreds injured in Britain's deadliest terrorist attack since the Lockerbie bombing. In this episode, we'll revisit the events of that terrible day when both Martin and I found ourselves on the front line of the chaos before most of the world knew what had happened. This is the story of 7/7, told through the eyes of journalists trying to report it. We'll also be talking to crisis communications expert Chris Webb, former head of news and deputy director of media and communication at the Metropolitan Police, about his memories of that day from inside the Met. He'll be sharing his insight on the difficulties and dilemmas faced by police in communicating with an understandably shocked and frightened public. Martin, I think it's fair to say it's one of those days when everybody remembers where they were and what they were doing. I was driving into the Sky Studios to present the lunchtime programme on 5 News when the story started breaking on the radio. Where were you?
I was in the wrong place.
As usual.
Well, not always, but certainly on that day, I very vividly remember where I was. I was on a train coming into London. We were just outside Croydon. And it was just after 9 o'clock and the train stopped. Now, it was Southern Rail. We were all used to that. No cause for alarm at that stage. The guard came ambling through each carriage saying that there was a bit of a problem with the underground. And very shortly after that, we started moving again. Then there was a second stop that was a bit longer. The same guard came through and said that there was some kind of power surge on the underground network, and the whole network was down. And I thought that was a bit odd. I could never remember the whole of the underground system being knocked out at the same time. And I began to think, well, what's the ultimate power surge, an explosion? And that really got my mind thinking about what might have happened. Most of the passengers were oblivious. Many of them had their heads in their newspapers, just absorbing the front page news of the previous day's announcement that London had won the right to hold the 2012 Olympics. So that was on everybody's mind. And I had just been to Scotland for the lead up to the G8 summit. And I'd done a story about the security plans around it. They'd built a huge metal fence around the Glen Eagles Hotel, which was the venue of G8. And I thought, well, on this day with London getting the Olympics, everybody at Scotland Yard's likely to be thinking about a security plan for the Olympics. And I thought, well, that's probably what I'll end up doing on that day. Somebody at Sky will ask me to look at the security implications and potential plans for making the London 2012 Olympics secure. I didn't really think any more about it than that.
I think you've just given us a great insight, though, into how your mind was probably working as a crime correspondent a bit differently to the other passengers on that train, because you mentioned the power outage and it had occurred to you that potentially that could mean an explosion. I'm guessing Knowing you and your work ethic, you got cracking straight away on this story from your stalled train.
I did. It really felt to me that something was up. So I called the news desk, and they didn't really know any more than I did. There were some scraps of information. It really, at that stage, was no more than a fire at a couple of underground stations. But at 9:24, the Met confirmed that Aldgate Station had an incident with casualties. So already it was beginning to get a bit more interesting. But of course, remember in those days, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. There weren't that many sources of outside information. Google was barely a tool. I was the one with contacts at Scotland Yard, the direct lines to press officers and officers. When I got through to the first one, I could detect there was a sense of controlled panic going on in the background. I was told that it was serious, there was more than one incident, and there were casualties. And I said, "Is anybody dead?" And I was told, "Yes, we think so, but don't report that at the moment." And I said, "Could it be terror?" And I was just told, well, maybe. Nobody really knew at that stage. So I moved to the train door alcove for a bit of privacy, relative privacy, and just relayed everything that I'd been told to the news desk. Then I was put on air, and I said on air that there were 5 explosions reported: King's Cross, Edgware Road, Aldgate, Russell Square and Liverpool Street. The coordination, I was being told, did suggest that this was terrorism. I also said that anti-terror officers were at the scene, but there was no confirmation that these were terror attacks. And I had to be very careful that I didn't myself start spreading alarm. But while I was on air, one of our news producers, Bob Mills, also rang in, and he knew far more than me. He'd actually been in Tavistock Square and watched the double-decker bus explode. So when I finished broadcasting, the train had fallen silent. A lot of passengers had overheard what I was saying. They were quite alarmed, and to be honest, so was I.
You were reporting in real time what the public and the authorities, and perhaps even you, hadn't fully grasped and taken in. So how did those next few hours unfold?
They were pretty chaotic. So my train was diverted because Victoria Station was shut. We got sent to Cannon Street, and I remember passengers staying on the train because by that stage people were beginning to catch up that there was something really awful happening. So a lot of them seemed to stay on the train in the hope that the train would just go back and take them away from this city under fire. I knew by then that our helicopter was already showing the first images of the wounded, people walking out of tube stations with their faces streaked with soot and dust, survivors staggering out looking, I suppose, like ghosts. There were no tubes running, there were no buses running, I couldn't find a taxi, so I had to walk the 2.5 miles to Scotland Yard. And the streets were packed with dazed Londoners. The rain was soaking us, there were sirens screaming everywhere. And just after 11 o'clock, it was 11:10 precisely, I remember, my phone died. The networks had collapsed under the weight of millions of calls. And it was sometime soon after that that the Met's new commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, he'd only been in the job for about 6 months, went on a tour of TV studios in Westminster. So he wanted to talk to all the major broadcasters. And I know that that was against the advice of his senior press officers. Their argument was that you can't put the chief up too quickly. And we'll talk to Chris Webb a bit later on about this, but Sir Ian Blair didn't know the full picture at that stage, and it was wrong for him, it was felt, to go on because he'd be asked awkward questions and he'd have to say, I don't know. I think for his sake, for Ian's sake, he wanted to show that he was in charge. So he did go on the air and he talked about 6 explosions, which is what, at the time, everybody thought. And the reason for that, it's easily explained that at 2 of the bomb sites, passengers had got out in the tunnel and they'd gone in different directions. And for instance, there was a bomb that had gone off after a train left King's Cross for Russell Square. So when it blew up, passengers got off and went in 2 directions. So you had passengers, survivors, coming up on the ground at King's Cross and at Russell Square. So people immediately thought that there'd been two different explosions. So that, I think, explains why there was confusion over the number of explosions. So there was a lot going on in my world. What was going on with you, Helen? What were you doing?
Well, I, by that time, arrived at the studios at 5 and remember the chaos. It was different chaos to you experienced at Sky News because we weren't actually live on air until after midday, but we were, of course, watching the story unfold on Sky, new details, developments happening every minute, not clear what was really happening. We were all struggling to take in the enormity of what had just taken place on British soil, and we were really shocked that our friend and colleague Bob Mills had watched the bus being blown up. I think we got him on the phone during the show. But for me personally, 7/7, as it would be known, was bringing back memories of 9/11 because I'd watched the towers come down on September the 11th in New York from not very far away. So I felt a sick feeling to watch that kind of horror unfold at 5. So in the hours after your initial reports, Martin, we did go to air for our lunchtime programme fairly shortly after Sir Ian Blair had been talking on news programmes and the full horror started to emerge. Just talk us through exactly what happened that morning when things started becoming a little bit more clear.
4 bombs went off and there were 4 bombers. We didn't know their identities for several days, but these were homegrown terrorists. 3 of them were young British men of Pakistani descent. Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who was 30, Shehzad Tanweer was 22, the youngest was Hasib Hussain, who was 18, and there was Jermaine Lindsay, who was 19, and he was of Jamaican background. Police called them clean skins, previously unknown to the authorities. That's what they meant by that. The gang had rented a flat in Leeds, and that's where they had constructed their bombs.
They coordinated their attacks with extraordinary precision, didn't they?
They did. At 4 a.m, Khan, Tanweer and Hussain left Leeds by car. Just before 7 a.m, they assembled in Luton Station car park where they met Lindsay. They loaded explosives into their rucksacks. Each of them had something between 2 and 5 kilograms of homemade bombs. Nail bombs were also found later in an abandoned rented car, but that didn't come for some days. They boarded a delayed train to London at 7:24 a.m. Witnesses later remembered they seemed relaxed, even laughing. At 8:23, they split up at King's Cross. Khan hugged Tanweer before heading west on the Circle Line. Lindsay boarded the Piccadilly line going south. Tanweer took the eastbound Circle Line. Hussain missed his train and wandered into McDonald's. Then a bit later, he boarded a bus.
And then, sadly, the carnage.
At 8:49 a.m, 3 bombs exploded within 50 seconds of each other. Tanweer's bomb tore through a Circle Line train between Liverpool Street and Aldgate. 7 were killed there. Khan's device detonated on the westbound train near Edgware Road. 6 were killed. Lindsay's blast ripped apart a Piccadilly line train between King's Cross and Russell Square. That was the biggest death toll, 26.
And the 4th bomb went off on the bus, which is what Bob saw. When did that happen?
That was about an hour after the tube blasts. At 9:47 a.m, Hussain detonated his rucksack bomb on a crowded number 30 bus in Tavistock Square. His bomb killed 13 people and injured 110. So not just those on the bus, it also caught up lots of people who'd been walking away from the tube station at King's Cross because everything was shut.
I still vividly remember the images of that bus ripped in half. And from what you've just said, it begs the question whether the bus was attacked because Hussain had missed his train. But the horror for passengers, people walking by, the victims and survivors, it's just unimaginable, really.
There were lots of people talking soon after. It was extraordinary what people were telling us. But I do remember there was one particular guy. He was a Met police officer, a dog handler, a young guy, and he said how he was nearby, saw what had happened and was trying to work out what to do. But he was concerned as a lot of coppers would, and this is a key to his training, he was concerned that there might be a second device because, of course, the experience in London, particularly of IRA bombs in the years leading up to this, or the years before this, was that the IRA terrorists would plant a bomb, it would go off, and it would draw in the emergency services who would then be hit by a second bomb. So that was this young cop's major concern. So he really was at a loss. He was on his own. He knew that he probably shouldn't go in, but he could see people trapped. And I remember him talking about how he just tied his dog to a railing outside the British Medical Association headquarters and headed into the debris of this bus. And there was something in there that he thought could be a second device. But whatever it was, he went over to it. As far as he could, he made sure that it wasn't a bomb and then helped one of the survivors out of the bus and then carried on helping others.
Well, I'm sure our guest, Chris Webb, who's joining us to discuss the police response and crisis management on that day, will have memories like that, which have stayed with him over the years. Chris is former head of news and deputy director of media and communications for the Metropolitan Police, and someone I spoke to nearly every day 4 decades ago when I was a baby reporter, and he was at the London Ambulance Service. Chris, welcome to True Criminals. It's such a treat to see you again after all these years.
Thank you, Helen, and you.
Where were you when you heard the news?
I was actually at Scotland Yard, and I think we got to put this in context and look at what happened on the 6th of July when London was awarded the 2012 Olympics. So that morning, the media coverage and the newspapers was full of 2012 and the plans for 2012. And I remember I walked from Waterloo Station across Westminster Bridge to Scotland Yard, which at the time was opposite St James's Park Underground Station, thinking, we've got 7 years now to get this right. We've got 7 years to actually make sure that the comms arrangements, the comms plans we put in place supported a successful delivery of the Olympic Games. And I got into the office about 8:30. Every morning we have a meeting at 9 o'clock where we review the press cuttings. We look at incidents that happened overnight and look at those incidents that might generate media coverage or actually warrant media coverage from a perspective of appeals and that sort of thing. And we'd started that meeting at 9 o'clock. I was in mid-flow, going through the incidents that happened overnight, looking at the press cuttings. And just after about 9:10, the duty officer from our press bureau, we have a 24-hour press bureau at Scotland Yard at the time, whose name was Alistair Campbell, no relation, walked in, interrupted the meeting and said, we're getting reports coming in of an explosion at Aldgate Underground Station. So I immediately stopped the meeting, went into the press bureau, find out what they actually knew at that time. And it was very confused. It was a very confused picture. But what we were being told, that this incident had been caused by a power surge on the underground system.
We've lost signals in the Tower Hill area and the Whitechapel area. So it could be an HT main cable.
Yeah.
So we're not looking at an active regression at the moment. It looks like a HT cable, blue. Yeah.
Okay. It looks as if the train's come off the road, Edgware Road, met, and gone into the tunnel wall, and taken some HT main cables down or something of that description.
Right.
And maybe that's caused some sort of overload or whatever, and sort of, had a knock-on effect elsewhere.
So they're not bombs?
No, it's not believed to be terrorist related.
So I authorised our first press statement at 9:24, which talked about at approximately 8:50 we were called to Aldgate to assist with an incident on the underground system, that all emergency services were on scene, have been some casualties, and a major incident had been declared, because that is what we were dealing with at that time. And by 9:40, we did think there were 5 explosions on the underground: King's Cross, Russell Square, Liverpool Street and Edgware Road, in addition to Aldgate. And not only was I dealing with the media handling, I was also having to manage partner agencies. And we learnt a lot on the back of 9/11. And we put in place significant arrangements for actually dealing with a multi-sited terror attack based on the experience of what happened in America in 2001. So one of the other things I did, I activated, we called it the first alert system, but to make other partner agencies aware that we were dealing with a significant incident. And I followed that up very quickly with a conference call with them, where we were able to share what each other knew at that point, which was very, very confused. So by 9:40, we thought we had had 5 explosions on the underground. I activated the departmental major incident plans, and just before 10 o'clock I was in the press bureau looking at the information that was coming in, both from a policing perspective. We were looking at the mainstream news media as well to find out what information they had. And just before 10 to 10, there was a huge explosion, and I heard it. I was on the 13th floor at Scotland Yard, and up until that point, we thought we were dealing with a power surge, because
you still thought it was a power surge?
Absolutely right. Because when I did that conference call with the different partner agencies, on that call was Transport for London, and they were saying that all their sophisticated equipment was telling them that there had been a massive power surge on the network. There had been explosions at local junction boxes, and trains had stopped in tunnels. So that's the purpose of those calls, so we all share what each other knows. So at that point, we still thought we were dealing with a power surge.
So what led you to think this was terrorism?
Well, when I heard the big explosion, and I thought it was actually directly outside Scotland Yard. It was so loud. And then very quickly, Bob Mills from Sky appeared. He was walking down the street, was in Tavistock Square, saw the top of the bus explode, and he was very quickly on air. And at that point, everything changed, because we were now not dealing with an accident as we thought it was. We were now dealing with acts of terror on the streets of London.
At around 11:10, 2 hours after the first emergency calls, the phone networks went down. I remember my phone died. The system was overloaded by millions of, I suppose, panicked calls, presumably from worried commuters and families. Everybody really was just trying to find out what was going on. I've read that police even considered jamming signals, fearing that mobile triggered bombs like in Madrid the year before. Was that a real consideration, Chris?
So there is the capability to turn off everybody else's phone apart from those that are equipped with a particular chip, which means that the phones actually keep working. There were discussions in relation to that happening, to putting that in place. There was mixed views on that. I think there was a view that by doing that, it could actually create greater panic. But not only that, at the time, the London Ambulance Service said that the only way that they could communicate with their senior officers was via mobile telephones, that those senior officers did not have access to radios. So that was a deciding factor. The Gold Commander did not decide to activate the closing down of those networks. And you're right, at that point, we didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't know whether these were being activated by mobile phones, as you said happened in Madrid a year earlier, whether there were some kind of timing devices on bags that had been left in carriages, or whether these were suicide bombers. We just did not know.
It's reassuring to hear that after the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington in 2001, that protocols had been put in place. You talked about partner agencies, which also I was going to ask you what you mean by that. You mentioned Transport for London, but does that mean ambulance, police, fire, all working together? But what other protocols were in place to help coordinate a response like this?
I think it's really important that you learn from history and you learn from incidents that have happened elsewhere. And I did, on the back of the dreadful incident of 9/11 in 2001, I looked at, and I was actually asked by the Minister for London, Chris Rainsford at the time, to look at whether London could deal with a multi-sited terror attack. And we had really effective plans in place. But the reality was that we would struggle to deal with a multi-sited terror attack. So one of the things that I put in place was that multi-agency group. We called it a gold comms group, with the heads of communications from the emergency services, the mayor's office, a local and central government, that would coordinate the comms response. And I led that group. And the other thing we put in place was we were used to actually deploying the comms response, the media and comms response when something happened to the scene. With a multi-sited terror attack, that was going to be impossible. A, from a safety perspective, but you cannot service multiple scenes. So as part of our planning, the arrangements we put in place were to set up a media centre as a single point of contact for actually dealing with the media should something like this happen.
There were no warnings of these bombs, but you had for a long time, I think, clearly anticipated that at some stage there would be an attack like this. Because I remember about a year before doing a story about MI5 being so concerned about the threat from extreme Islamists that agency, was given a 50% boost to its fund so it could recruit, and I think at the time it was said perhaps another 1,000 intelligence analysts. So there were, not just for the police and your partner agencies, but the spooks themselves were preparing for this eventuality, weren't they?
You're absolutely right. And John Stevens, when he was commissioner, spoke at a police authority meeting.
I was there.
And he said it's not if, it's when. And we all knew that at some point London was likely to suffer from some kind of a multi-sided terror attack.
And of course this fell on the plate of the Met's new commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, who was fairly new in the post. Were you involved in his response as well? And as Martin alluded to earlier, perhaps he'd made a move a little too soon, although you don't want to criticise when something like this is happening because people do need information, don't they?
It's well documented that me and Ian Blair had a difficult conversation in his office about 10:30 on that Thursday morning. I got a call from his staff officer to say that the boss was going out the front to speak to the press. Because obviously by this time we had people like Martin that were starting to arrive at Scotland Yard, because Scotland Yard in these situations are always a focal point. We knew we had journalists outside Scotland Yard and camera crews were starting to arrive. So I got this call from his staff officer and I went down and we had a difficult conversation. And the gist of that conversation was, Commissioner, we do not know if this is over yet. It's 45 minutes since the bus has exploded in Tavistock Square. Whatever you say now, you are going to be judged against. And if you get this wrong, this could put you into difficult territory. Because I was always taught, and it's held me in good stead throughout my career, you never go too high too soon. Because these situations always evolve. And what you think you know in the early stages often changes. And my concern was, if we put up our top person within the Metropolitan Police, i.e. the Commissioner, we would have nowhere to go if things developed. So he listened to my argument, and there were other senior officers there, and they all said, you need to listen to the advice that Chris is giving you. And he considered my opinion, and he said, I've heard what you say, but I'm going to do it anyway. And that is his entitlement. At the end of the day, my role is in my title. I am a communication advisor. I can only offer my advice and professional opinion. Ultimately, it's up to senior officers whether they decide to accept that. So he actually decided that he was going to go and talk to the media, and that's when we decided we wouldn't do it outside Scotland Yard. We would take the Commissioner to Millbank, which is what we'd planned for, so that he could broadcast live into news programmes.
Do you think with hindsight, you still think you were right and he was wrong? I imagine from Ian's point of view, he wanted to show that somebody was in charge and somebody needed to get across a message that people shouldn't panic. He wanted to avert hysteria. Surely that was part of his thinking and it was an important thing to do.
I don't know why he made the decision he did or what was in his thinking. I'm not going to try and judge why he decided to do what he did. Do the public really care about who's actually talking to them in the early stages of an incident? No, they don't. They want to see somebody in uniform that's providing that public reassurance and public confidence, irrespective of rank. I think what those events did, they set up then a chain whereby developments thereafter, so the 21/7 failed bomb attacks, the shooting of John Charles de Menezes, there was a view then that the person that would front that would be the Commissioner. And as we know, that he got into difficulty then with what he said after John Charles de Menezes was shot. So I think it's always difficult when you put your top person up. I still hold the belief that you need to wait. You can put spokespeople up until you know you've got a degree of control over what is happening, because otherwise it can get you into difficult territory.
You said as well, Martin, didn't you, at the time, that the 6 explosions confused viewers?
Yes, and it was understandable how that mistake arose. Victims, survivors were walking out of different stations. So trains that blew up in between 2 stations, passengers got off where they could and walked along the line and came up at, and I gave an example, King's Cross and Russell Square. The train blew up halfway between those 2 stations and survivors walked out up onto the ground at those 2 different stations. So the immediate thought was that there had been 2 explosions there, and the same at Liverpool Street and Aldgate.
We need ambulances and water to King's Cross.
I understand what you're saying.
And Russell Square.
Yeah, we'll get what we can to you. Okay.
And Russell Square's a priority.
Russell Square, King's Cross.
Yeah, but with Russell Square as a priority.
It looks like we're going to have it as a major incident, so we'll get ambulances to you wherever I can, okay?
Code amber the whole network. We're going to stop the whole network.
We've got a report of another explosion at Liverpool Street as well.
But that's what we're thinking, is that terrorist incident.
How critical, Chris, is the role of media and communications in the Met in situations like this to guide and help the public and also to keep people calm?
It's very important. What you've got to bear in mind is that in 2005, as Martin's alluded to, there was no social media. So both the media and the public were reliant on the police and the emergency services telling them what was happening. I remember authorising a statement to go out at 10:10, shortly after the bomb exploded in Tavistock Square. And that statement said that emergency services are responding to reports of multiple explosions at various locations, because we didn't know how many locations we actually had. As part of that statement, we also gave the advice, it was referred to as GISTI, go in, stay in, tune in. In other words, get inside, stay inside, and tune in to local radio and television. Our priority at that time was keeping people safe. And the only way we knew that we could keep people safe was getting them off the streets and into buildings, because we didn't know what was likely to come. I think it's about keeping people appraised. There's two issues that I would like to get across. As the day progressed, we had millions of people holed up in offices, in hotels. We knew that was not sustainable. So by 2:00, we knew that we were going to have to start to get people home. And that brought its own concerns as well. I remember having a conversation with the Gold Commander, and there were real fears about whether the terrorists were watching and waiting for that to happen before they launched another wave of attacks. And it was a very brave decision that he had to make just after 2:00 to tell people to start to make your way home. But we were really fearful that we would get a second series of explosions. And the only way we could deal with that was what we'd done several hours before. So that was a real concern at that point. So as the day progressed, the information was really, really important. My colleagues from the Cabinet Office did an amazing job of getting the QE2 conference centre in Westminster up and running by 1:00 as a media centre. And we did a press conference there at 3:00 with Brian Paddock and Andy Trotter, who was at the time with British Transport Police. And at that press conference, we were able to confirm that there were 33 fatalities and 700 people had actually been injured. A number of those had sustained life-changing injuries. And that was the start of daily press conferences at that facility.
Was your heart in your mouth, Chris, when people were encouraged to start to go home? You just talked about all those people with life-changing injuries, presumably hospitals trying to cope with bodies and injured people. How did you feel about sending people home, knowing that you were nervous there could be a second wave?
I was really concerned. Once we'd made that decision, I actually went into my office and wrote a plan. We had our major incident plans, but I needed a strategy about what happens if we get more bombs this afternoon. And I wrote a strategy about how we would respond to that. And bearing in mind, there was no underground. The underground system was still suspended throughout London. So the only way that the people could get home was by bus or by walking to mainline stations. So you literally, for several hours, had millions of people on the streets, either walking to mainline stations, walking home, or large queues at bus stops. Another target for terrorists. It could not be ruled out.
Difficult to know what the alternative was. You couldn't tell people to stay in their offices
and
the pubs and so forth forever.
You couldn't. It was a difficult decision, but that's what Gold Commanders, and that's why you have the command structure you do, so that those difficult decisions can be made by the Gold Commander based on the information and the intelligence that's available at that time.
It seems like there was a very good relationship between you and correspondents like Martin. In fact, I think you released CCTV footage to the media because the news crews couldn't get to the scene.
So you've got to bear in mind that it was a really busy news period. We had the announcement in Singapore of the Olympics. We had the G8 summit of world leaders in Glen Eagles. So news gathering was actually quite stretched before this happened. And I was getting calls from news desks saying, we haven't got enough camera crews. Is there any way you can help us with footage? So what you do have around London, you have a number of cameras in fixed positions that help with traffic management, which the media have access to. So I had a discussion with the Gold Commander, and we agreed that as long as the images were not traumatic, we would give the news media access to those cameras for use for news purposes. And that is the first time that had ever been done.
Do you remember that, Martin?
I do, and I think it established a good relationship from the start of this whole incident. The flow of information that really did set a very good example about how police and media can get on at a moment of crisis. It wasn't always brilliant, and there were plenty of episodes where we demanded more information and you either didn't know the answers to the questions we were asking, or for operational reasons you weren't prepared to tell us.
Martin's talked about the attacks on the undergrounds, and I just want to come back to the attack on the bus, which happened an hour after the attack on the underground. And what subsequently transpired was the bus bomber, whose name was Hasib Hussein, he was spotted in Boots at King's Cross, and he bought a battery. And what we do not know is if he tried to detonate his device on the underground and it failed to explode, but on the morning in question, the Northern Line was suspended because either signal failure or there's a broken down train. Now, in the statement that was put out by Al-Qaeda afterwards, they talked about London burning in north, east, south and west. And if you look at where the other attacks were, they were east, south and west. And there is a real view that Hasib Hussein has walked around for some time. We know he tried to call the other terrorists, who by this time were dead, before making a decision to board that bus and then blowing himself up sometime later in Tavistock Square. There is a very strong view that the bus was not his intended target.
He may have simply lost his nerve on the tube.
Possibly.
And then got it back when he got on the bus.
Yeah, possibly.
And we'll never know answers to those kind of questions.
Do you know why there was such a big death toll in the Piccadilly line train?
No.
So the other underground trains were actually open. So Edgware Road and Aldgate, you had open lines.
Okay.
Yeah. On the Piccadilly line between King's Cross and Russell Square, it's what they call a double whammy. So the explosion has happened, it's gone out and hit the tunnel walls, and it's what they call a repeat explosion. So it's gone bang, bang, because it's hit the tunnel walls and come back in again. With the other bombs, it's exploded and dispersed. And then with the Piccadilly line, it's hit the tunnel wall and the explosions then come back in on itself. And that's why there was such a huge death toll.
They're still desperately waiting for emergency services. We've got two major incidents.
Yeah, the emergency services have declared they're on their way down there. We're issuing a system-wide code amber.
So many lives were destroyed that day. And the injuries, those who were lucky enough to survive, the injuries, many of them were absolutely life-changing, weren't they?
There were, and you hear some really distressing, and you see some distressing images and hear the stories of those that have life-changing injuries, who have lost limbs. Terrorism causes great trauma. When people are killed, you've then got the impact on the families of those who have died, and you've then got the impact on those who are injured. And 7/7, there were some catastrophic injuries that were caused to a number of individuals.
It's astonishing, some of the detail that I remember. There was one guy who we read afterwards that he had lots of shrapnel, if you like, debris of the blast extracted from his legs, including his own car keys.
Yep, absolutely. And I read a story that on one of the underground trains, one of the injured picked up his limb and actually then hopped off the underground train to go and seek help.
What presence of mind.
Absolutely.
And then this extraordinary spirit that comes from people with life-changing injuries who are grateful they survived and always very respectful to the people who set out that day to go to work, go to their offices, go wherever they were going and never came back. I think people who have been very badly injured are very aware of that too, aren't they?
Absolutely. And you've got to bear in mind that on that summer morning, 52 people went out to work and 52 people did not go home.
When, Martin, did it start to come clear about who might be behind the attacks?
Well, I remember it seemed pretty obvious to me from early on who was responsible, because as Chris has said, Sir John Stevens, who was the previous commissioner 4 years earlier, in the days after 9/11, had stood up at that Metropolitan Police Authority meeting and said, make no mistake, we're next. And ever since then, rail and tube train passengers had got used to posters and platform announcements warning them to be vigilant. Now the day had arrived.
We knew after the bomb exploded in Tavistock Square just before 10 o'clock that London was now under attack by terrorists, so we knew it was a terror attack. Ian Blair, when he went to Millbank at 11:15, also confirmed that, as did the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, when he did a press conference at Gleneagles at midday. But it was some days before we were able to confirm that these were suicide bombers, and we would come under considerable pressure from the media to try and clarify that point. But in the early stages, we just could not do that.
And at some early stage, an offshoot, what appeared to be an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, had claimed responsibility. What did you make of that?
We were aware that Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for the attack, but it wasn't unusual at the time for Al-Qaeda to claim responsibility for attacks they were not involved in. And we were not going to give that statement any credence at that point.
What Margaret Thatcher called the oxygen of publicity.
Absolutely right. I have to say, the Counter-Terrorism Command, when this happened, did a fantastic job. They spent some time trawling through hours and hours of CCTV, and they then eventually identified a group of people whose behaviour led them to think, could these be suicide bombers?
But you suspected it on day one, didn't you?
We couldn't rule it out. And interestingly, we set up something called Casualty Bureau, which is something that is set up in major incidents where the loved ones of people who think might be involved can actually call the police and lodge their details. And the family members of one of the bombers actually called Casualty Bureau to report them missing.
Did they?
They did, yeah. And that also then led police to believe that what we were dealing with could be suicide bombers. But it was a couple of days before we had some degree of certainty that that was the case.
Although, interestingly, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair's briefing and Al-Qaeda saying that they were behind the explosions all came minutes before we went to air on 5 News. I knew there was something critical happening just as we were going to air with our lunchtime live programme on that day. How differently do you think might the Met handle a similar attack, God forbid, today? And how perhaps has social media changed things?
I think it's really hard. I think policing now faces immense challenges with social media because you are no longer telling the story. The public are now telling the story. And to be quite honest, statements coming from the police or the emergency services can often be irrelevant because the time they're actually released, the public have told you what's going on. Where the police and the other emergency service now have a responsibility is to provide that reassurance and confidence. And when I do training, I always say, don't tell me that you're responding to reports of X because I know that because it's all over social media, but I'm in the midst of what's going on. I need you to tell me what I need to do. Do I need to stay where I am? Do I need to move to a place of safety or do I need to go to somewhere else? And often that's the missing part when the police and the other emergency services put out statements. So it's completely changed now from where it was in 2005, where you were actually providing information about the actual incident itself. The public are now doing that, and the police now have a role in that public confidence and that public reassurance to become that credible voice of the response to a disaster.
Before social media, you used to talk about controlling the narrative for very good reasons. But of course, you've absolutely lost the narrative with the onset of social media.
You have, Martin, but I'm a still great believer of controlling the narrative. And I think by engaging with the mainstream media like yourself, you can actually control that narrative because you can debunk some of the speculation and misinformation that is going on social media. If you don't have that relationship, if you're not prepared to engage with journalists, well, then people have got free rein to actually report what they want, as we saw with the Nicola Bulley case.
The woman who vanished into the river in
Absolutely,
Lancashire.
up in Lancashire. And what you can ill afford to do when you're dealing with something of this nature, a high-profile incident, a major incident, is to create a void, to create a vacuum. Because once you do that, it will be filled with misinformation and you lose control. And this is not about controlling the media. I do not like that word, controlling the media or managing the media, but you can control the narrative. And I believe you can still successfully control the narrative today, despite social media, if you have the right tools and you're willing to engage with the mainstream media to do that.
Chris, you've described very eloquently what your day looked like with your work hat on. But on a personal front, what were your abiding memories of 7/7?
Well, I didn't get home for several days.
I bet you didn't. Did you just work through the night?
Well, one of the first things I actually did do, and again, it was in our plans, the Met was fortunate to have quite a big media and communications team. At 11 o'clock on that morning, I sent 6 of those off to the hotel opposite St James's Park. Because they were my night shift, they were going to come back and take over from me, because we were going to have a lot of tired people at 11 o'clock that night, and I needed fresh bodies to come in and see things through the night. So my own personal recollection is things move very, very quickly. I did manage to put in a call to home to say that I'm okay and everything's all right, but then I didn't get home for 3 days thereafter. And that brought its own challenges to a certain extent, because at the time I was actually doing some decorating. So that all had to be put on hold.
Also, hearing the explosion, is that something you ever think back to when you're having a more reflective day about all the different things you've done in your career?
I've dealt with many major incidents, and my first major incident was in 1987, which was the King's Cross Underground fire.
So I covered that too.
Yeah, yes.
In fact, we both did that, didn't we? That was my first big story.
So that's when I was with London Ambulance Service, and you were in National News.
National News, yes.
And I'm used to actually dealing with significant levels of trauma and seeing horrible sights. So although I heard the explosion, my biggest concern and my biggest fear at that point was not for myself, not for my staff, because I knew we were safe. It was for the people of London, for the people out on the streets, because I had absolutely no idea what was going to come next. And although you want to try and keep those people safe, and bearing in mind, we haven't got thousands of police officers that we can actually deploy to do that. So that effective engagement with the media to actually get our messages out to keep people safe was crucial. And for me, I've always come at this, that the media are a stakeholder. They should not be kept at arm's length, but they should be embraced, because they're going to be the people that get you out of trouble and support you when you really need it.
It does make you feel, as a member of the public, somewhat reassured that all this thought process goes on behind the scenes on such a dreadful day. Thanks, Chris, for sharing your insight and what was going on behind the scenes. And we're going to talk to you more on our next episode about the aftermath of 7/7. Martin, as we close this episode, where did the story go next?
Well, things were beginning to crystallise. Just after 6 p.m, the death toll was put at 37. And then shortly after that, it went up 1 because one of the survivors, badly injured, had died in hospital. The Foreign Secretary was on air. He said that the attacks bore all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. By midnight that first day, police had recovered the bomber Khan and Tanweer's IDs, along with bomb components. As Chris has already told us, the youngest bomber, the 18-year-old Hussein, he'd been reported missing by his family at 10:19 that night. So from then on, the 7/7 story now entered a new phase. The next 3 weeks would see the search for accomplices of those bombers who'd died, the botched 21st of July bomb attacks, the frantic manhunt for those failed bombers on the loose, and the tragic killing of John Charles de Menezes.
Well, in our next episode, we'll explore the aftermath and legacy of 7/7. Join us then. Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.